Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're taking a look at the Ryzen 5 5600X 3D, a CPU that I suspect many gamers are going to be a bit upset that AMD is releasing, despite it being rather good. And I think that's the problem. You see, ever since the release of the 5800X 3D, budget gamers have been wishing for a cheaper 6-core version. But sadly, it didn't really make sense for AMD to create such a product. But before I explain why, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Skytech Gaming and their collaboration with Intel and Signal RGB to create a Diablo 4 inspired PC, which will be given away to one lucky gamer. This one-of-a-kind masterpiece features swirling potions that react with your health and resources in real time. This is made possible by the Signal RGB app, which synchronizes RGB devices from any brand to bring you a cohesive lighting experience. The hand-painted chest also contains a 13th gen Intel Core i5 13600K and GeForce RTX 4070. So to enter the giveaway, click the link in the video description. Now, it didn't really make sense for AMD to create a 6-core X3D CPU until they had accumulated enough defective 5800X 3D silicon, at which point they could isolate the defective cores and sell them as 6-core versions. The problem is, though, the supply of defective 5800X 3Ds is rather limited, and that's why it took AMD a little over a year to stockpile enough to release the 5600X 3D, and even then, supply is still very limited, evidenced by the fact that this is a US exclusive to be sold via just a single retailer, and that retailer is Micro Center. So unless you live in the US and a Micro Center is conveniently located, your chances of getting a 5600X 3D, well, they're pretty slim. That said, if you do happen to meet those requirements, you probably won't want one anyway, and that's because they cost $230 US, which at first that seems like a pretty great deal. That is until you realize that Micro Center is somehow selling 5800X 3Ds for just $260 US. I'm really not sure how Micro Center does it. They're clearly doing some kind of behind the scenes deals with AMD, as the next best price right now for a 5800X 3D is $330 US over on Amazon. And that's about as cheap as I've seen this part at other retailers. Anyway, loads of you have been begging for a 5600X 3D review, and I'll be honest, I'm not super interested in this product from a consumer standpoint, despite organizing one from the US at quite a large cost. And this is because, as I've explained, this just makes no sense to purchase. You just get the 5800X 3D for $30 more, and on top of that, the vast majority of our audience can't even buy it anyway. Also, we've benchmarked AM4 processors to death here at Hardware Unboxed over the last year, and in particular, the 5800X 3D has seen a lot of benchmark action. So that being the case, I've decided that I won't be doing our standard sort of review format, and instead I'll be comparing it head to head with the only CPU that I think really matters, the 5800X 3D. At this point, we know exactly how the 5800X 3D compares to basically everything, so we might as well just compare the 5600X 3D with it. So let's just go ahead and do that. For testing, the AM4 CPUs were installed on the MSI MPG X570S Carbon Max Wi-Fi using DDR4 3600CL14 memory. Then for the graphics card, we're again using the Asus ROG Strix RTX 4090 OC edition, which has been benchmarked at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. So let's get into it. First up, we have Spider-Man Remastered, and here the 5800X 3D delivered 16% more frames on average at 1080p, with 8% stronger 1% lows. We're then looking at similar scaling at 1440p, as the game is still CPU limited, but by the time we hit the 4K resolution, the game does become entirely GPU limited. Now, enabling ray tracing can increase the CPU load, and while I'm sure it does here, it also increases the GPU load. Though interestingly, the results here do still look mostly CPU limited, even at 4K. But all said and done, the 5800X 3D was up to 7% faster. Now, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a very CPU demanding game, especially the village section that we use for testing. And interestingly, although the 1% lows are much the same using either CPU, the average frame rate was 14% greater for the 5800X 3D at 1080p, though that margin was reduced to 6% at 1440p and then eliminated at the GPU limited 4K resolution. The Last of Us Part 1 punishes CPUs with its constant texture streaming, resulting in 70 to 80% usage for the 5800X 3D. And this saw the 5600X 3D at near 100% capacity for most of our test, and as a result the 8-core model was quite a bit faster, especially when looking at the 1% lows. At 1080p, the average frame rate for the 5800X3D was 13% greater, but it was the 20% increase to the 1% lows that was most noticeable. Now, the 5600X3D was certainly very playable in this game, but you could potentially extract much more performance with the 8-core model, depending on your GPU and the quality settings used. Moving on to a Plague Tale Requiem, we see that the 5800X3D is up to 10% faster at 1080p, and then 12% faster at 1440p. So both the 1080p and 1440p data is very CPU limited, but then of course, once we do hit that 4K resolution, the results become heavily GPU limited. And then moving on, we have Hogwarts Legacy, and this is another example where the data is heavily CPU limited, but the 5600X3D was able to match the 1% lows of the 5800X3D, which is a bit surprising, and especially given that it was 9% slower when looking at the average frame rate. And even at the 4K resolution, the game is still largely CPU bound, though I should note that the 7800X3D and Core i9-13900K are able to max the RTX 4090 out at 100 FPS. Then with ray tracing enabled, we're heavily CPU limited, as the RTX 4090 should be good for 63 FPS at 4K, 76 FPS at 1440p, and then at 1080p we are yet to test a stock CPU that can drive more than 78 FPS. What we do know though is that in this example, the extra cores of the 5800X3D aren't helping, suggesting that we are heavily limited by the primary thread. Moving on, we see the 5600X3D maxed out at 134 FPS in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, allowing the 8-core model to deliver an additional 10% performance at 1080p, hitting 147 FPS, though the 1% lows were improved by 14% in this example. Now, the 1440p results are much more GPU limited. Here, the 5800X3D was just 4% faster, and then, as you'd expect based on that, we are completely GPU limited at 4K. The Watch Dogs Legion results are very similar at 1080p. The 5800X3D was 9% faster and then 11% faster at 1440p. These certainly aren't massive margins, and the 6-core processor was very usable, but also right now the 5800X3D costs just 13% more, at least based on the Micro Center pricing, so you might as well just get that. We also see a similar thing in Resident Evil 4. Here the 5800X3D is 8% faster at 1080p and 7% faster at 1440p. And then of course, we see no difference at the heavily GPU limited 4K resolution. We're also seeing more of the same in Halo Infinite. The 5800X3D was just 7 to 8% faster at 1080p and then 6% faster at 1440p before the results became heavily GPU limited at 4K. So the extra cores are helping here, but in this example, they don't make a world of difference. The Callisto Protocol also sees a small performance advantage when using the 5800X3D over the 5600X3D, just 5 to 6% at 1080p in this example, and then up to 5% at 1440p. Of course, at 4K we're again GPU limited, so performance is much the same. The Far Cry 6 results, they do look very familiar. Here we are again looking at very typical margins, with the 5800X3D winning by 6 to 7% at 1080p, and then we see similar margins at 1440p, and you guessed it, we are once again heavily GPU limited at the 4K resolution. We're also seeing up to 6% more performance from the 5800X3D in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and then just 4% at 1440p, and then nothing at 4K. So very similar performance figures here from the 5800X3D and new 5600X3D. And Hitman 3, it has more of the same for us. 6% more performance at 1080p and 1440p, with nothing to see at 4K. Here we can see that Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't provide a challenge for either of these 3D V-Cache CPUs, with both delivering around 300 FPS at 1080p, and here the 8-core model was just 5% faster. Now we still have more than half a dozen games to go over, but we're now getting to the point where the margins are less than 5%, so rather than bore you with all of that data, let's just take a look at the big breakdown graphs. Okay, so on average, across the 26 configurations tested, the 5800X3D was just 6% faster than the 5600X3D. Now, if we remove the obviously GPU limited results in anything that saw a margin of 5% or less, the 5800X3D becomes 9% faster, so not a big difference there. That said though, given that it only costs 13% more right now, you might as well just get the 8-core model and enjoy those extra cores. Interestingly, the margin overall is slightly smaller when focusing on the 1% lows, and we see just 3 titles with double-digit margins. Then at 1440p, the 5800X3D was just 5% faster on average, so not a big difference here. And as you would expect for the most part, the margins did shrink at the higher resolution as performance became more GPU limited. There was also just a 4% margin when looking at the 1% lows, though the 5800X3D was still a good bit faster in Fortnite using ray tracing and The Last of Us Part 1. Then finally, at 4K, the 5800X3D was just 1% faster on average because, of course, for almost every single test, we were 100% GPU limited. The 4K data, in my opinion, it's basically worthless, but a disturbing amount of people do demand that we include these results, so here they are. What the hell, I'm providing them. I guess I gave in. Of course, it's the same story when looking at the 1% lows, because again, we're just measuring GPU performance here, and we really have no idea which CPU is the best, just based on the 4K data alone, that is. In fact, this data highlights just how foolish 4K CPU results are, because based on this data, you just assume that the 5800X3D is a waste of money, and you might as well just save the $30 and get the 5600X3D. And that'd be a big old yikes if that was your conclusion. So there you have it, the 5600X3D. It's a cool concept, but sadly at current prices it just doesn't make sense. Had it been released alongside the 5800X3D, it would have cost $300 US. Well, that is assuming that AMD matched the MSRP of the original part. So I suppose in the case of the 5800X3D, that's slotted in at the original $450 US MSRP of the 5800X. And that being the case, the 5600X3D, that should have come in at the same $300 US price as the 5600X. And had that been the case, it would have cost 33% less, making it a very attractive option for budget gamers. The problem is it made no sense for AMD to make such a product, because doing so would have seen them selling X3D CPUs for $300 that could have just been sold for $450, and well, that just makes no sense. Really, the only chance for the 5600X3D to exist was what ultimately happened. AMD stockpiled defective dies until they had enough silicon to release a limited run of 6-core models. Of course, the problem now being that, as of March, the 5800X3D has been selling for as low as $300, and over the past few months has dipped below $300 at certain retailers. And right now, at the time of filming this video, both B&H and Newegg are selling 5800X3Ds for $330 US, which is just over 40% more expensive than the 5600X3D at Micro Center, and that would make the 5600X3D a decent deal and probably worth buying, but of course that's ignoring the fact that Micro Center also sells the 5800X3D for just $260. So if you ignore Micro Center's own 5800X3D deal, then sure, the 5600X3D looks pretty good, but you can only buy the 5600X3D at Micro Center, so that being the case, you would just buy the 5800X3D, making the 5600X3D completely pointless. At the end of the day though, this was a fun exercise that allowed us to see how a 6-core Zen 3 3D V-Cache CPU compared to the 5800X3D for gaming, and it turns out 6 cores is still fine. Who would have thought? It might be interesting to see how the 5600X3D compares to the 5600X, but if it's anything like the 5800X3D versus 5800X, which it will be, you can expect around a 15% uplift across a massive range of games, with some titles showing upwards of 40% gains, with others showing no performance improvement at all. Anyway, if you're already on the AM4 platform and you're looking for a cost-effective CPU upgrade for gaming, then getting yourself one of those cheap 5800X3D CPUs is the way to go. Everyone else is just better off looking at AMD's newer AM5 or Intel's LJ1700 platforms. And that is going to do it for this one. If you enjoyed the video, you know what to do. Subscribe for more content also, because we have some more new CPU content coming up later this week. And I haven't mentioned it yet, but you might have noticed I'm wearing our new meme merch, the It Depends hoodie. You can get that over at our store, so hardwareunboxed.com. Check that out if you're interested. Unfortunately, at this point in time, it is only available for those of you based in the US. But we are working on making our merch more available, and yeah, it's been a slow process. But anyway, this looks pretty cool. The 8-bit It Depends meme merch. Check that out if you're interested. Also, we have Floatplane and Patreon. You can sign up to either one of those things and get access to more Hardware Unboxed goodness. We do a monthly live stream for members. We have a Discord server, behind the scenes content, Q&A stuff. A lot of cool things there. Check it out if you're interested. But if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.